The Oklahoma Sooners have now officially wrapped up their first season of football in the SEC with only a bowl game remaining. And it was a season of riveting highs, crushing lows, quarterback controversies, trying to find their identity in this new conference, and much, much more. Welcome back to State of the Association. I'm your host, Nash Roberts. Today, we are talking about the Oklahoma Sooners' first season in the SEC, the college that I will soon be attending. Welcome back to State of the Association. I'm your host, Nash Roberts. To begin, let's take a look at how the season as a whole went for them. As with pretty much any big college, they would open up their season playing against a little bit lesser competition, and of course they would go on to win those games. Now, for years, Oklahoma has had a good offense, but the thing that really stood out that was notable from these games, especially the one against Temple, where they won 51-3, was this team's defense. This was a team that for so long had had an offensively focused identity, and their defense would kind of fall to the wayside, often to their detriment. But the defensive unit looked great. Quarterback Jackson Arnold got his first proper reps in the regular season as a starter. He played in their bowl game against Arizona the year prior, but this was his first season really under the helm, taking the charge for the Oklahoma Sooners. He sat behind Dylan Gabriel for a year. That's a guy who has been one of the most prolific college quarterbacks over the past couple of years. Last two especially, he was at some points at least been a Heisman candidate. And going into the year, there was a lot of optimism for Jackson Arnold going back to that Arizona game from the year prior in his freshman season. He did have 2 touchdowns to 3 picks. However, he threw a lot of yards. And one thing that is really crucial for any quarterback to succeed is confidence. And for him to be consistently moving the ball downfield in spite of the turnovers, that was a good sign. And there was plenty of optimism for Jackson Arnold entering the year. And he starts off the year, he's not necessarily playing bad if you go by the counting stats. However, his impact on the game and just he's having some turnovers that are taking the team out of it, especially when we get into the more difficult games like the one against Tennessee, notably. He had 3 first-half turnovers in that game against Tennessee and was benched. The man coming in for him, Mike Hawkins Jr., a guy who has a true legacy at Oklahoma just because of his name alone, as his dad once played there as well. And this is someone who wasn't just a hire in addition to the roster just because of his dad. This was someone who, in that game against Tennessee, while Oklahoma was not able to come back, Mike Hawkins Jr. showed a lot of heart, a lot of passion for the game. And it was something that you really hadn't seen from Jackson Arnold up to that point. Both quarterbacks have a very similar style. They can be both very well dual threat quarterbacks. But with Mike Hawkins Jr., he really looked like he wanted to win, and that was something that often seemed like it was lacking from Jackson Arnold. And while Oklahoma did not win that game against Tennessee, and many people can point to that as when the season kind of took a downturn, there were positive takeaways from it because their defense kept them in that game the whole way through. And it really set the idea of that this defense is going to be able to keep them in a lot of games. Even against these big heavyweight powerhouse SEC teams, their defense is going to give them a chance. It's just on the offense to be able to capitalize on it. And ultimately, Mike Hawkins Jr. would get the nod and start from the first snap that next game. And for the next couple of weeks, he was the guy at quarterback for the Oklahoma Sooners. And one thing that Hawkins did do well was that he limited turnovers. However, there were times that he was too conservative at passing the ball, and his numbers looked even more pedestrian when compared to Arnold, who, despite the turnovers, put up solid box score numbers. And so then you kind of had to make the decision of the conservative guy, who you have to trust to play just well enough to, be able to ride on that defense and trust Mike Hawkins Jr. to at least lead the offense to a couple of scores, or the high-risk, high-reward Jackson Arnold. And ultimately, they would go back to Arnold, and he finished the year quite solid. Not as turnover-prone as before, but now Jackson Arnold, as of yesterday, is going to be hitting the transfer portal, so he is not the answer at quarterback for the Oklahoma Sooners. And this is a guy who was a 5-star prospect. I believe he might have been the best quarterback in his class. at least prospect-wise, and he chose to go to Oklahoma. And that was a big get for them. And it looked like sitting a year behind Dylan Gabriel was going to be the right decision for Jackson Arnold, and that he had all the potential in the world to be the next great Oklahoma quarterback. But ultimately, that did not work out. And we saw the highs and lows of Jackson Arnold this season. You could definitely tell at moments that it was his first year starting, and also, obviously, that this is Oklahoma's first year in the SEC. So for Jackson Arnold, wherever he goes next, there is plenty of talent there. It's just a matter of his mentality and how he responds to the situation that he was in Oklahoma and how he becomes better from it. It can be a learning experience, and it can really take him to the next level if done right. Moving on from that quarterback controversy, though, and it'll be interesting to see what Oklahoma does with the quarterback situation. Now, if Mike Hawkins Jr. stayed in the whole time, the remainder of the season after he originally came in for Arnold, this wouldn't be a debate. But now there is, because for performance reasons, Hawkins ultimately got benched for Jackson Arnold. So we'll see whatever situation goes down with that. But moving on to our next topic, and that is the identity of this Oklahoma team that was really found this year. As stated previously, this is a team that has consistently been offensively focused, perhaps to their detriment at times. They can put up 40 points. They might allow 40 points. They were like the Cincinnati Bengals of this year's NFL season. But this year coming in, you had two seniors coming in, or rather staying with the team, as opposed to going to the draft, because they wanted to lead this team into the SEC and create a defensive culture that was going to be beyond their years. Create one that was going to endure in Oklahoma, even when they're gone for the draft. And those were Billy Bowman and Denny Sussman. And Denny Sussman has consistently been one of the best linebackers in college football in recent years. He was one of the best in the Big 12, if not the best, and he has continued to be one of the best in the SEC. He has led Oklahoma in tackles for multiple years. In that first year that he did it wasn't that impressive because their defense wasn't too great. But this year it looked amazing, and that was largely due to the leadership and play of Billy Bowman and Denny Sussman. As a safety for Billy Bowman, despite his limited size perhaps, he has a great football IQ. And he's really got the versatility to play at multiple levels. Like, he was close to the line of scrimmage quite a bit of times, and he was a good run defender. This is someone who has a lot of versatility on the defensive end. And combined his leadership along with Denny Sussman's, that's a recipe for success. And while they are leaving this year, and that is obviously going to be a negative for this Oklahoma Sooners defense, I think that in staying for their senior years and going into the SEC with these Oklahoma Sooners and passing on their knowledge to the young guys, their versatility to the young guys, I think that's going to be huge for this defense in the future and really a shift for the Oklahoma Sooners going from this offensive-minded team to defense. Because while Jackson Arnold was projected high, obviously that didn't work out. Mike Hawkins Jr. ultimately, we'll see what happens with him. But at the end of the day, you don't have Baker Mayfield, you don't have Kyler Murray, you don't have Jalen Hurts anymore. And you can your defense can allow 40 points because those guys are going to get those back. But now that the offense becomes more uncertain, you have to find new identities as well. And I think that this defense is going to continue to be good for this Oklahoma team. It kept them in a lot of games this year. Ultimately, their offense was not able to capitalize on that, and sometimes the defense didn't, like in the game against LSU. But look at the Alabama game. That actually led to them winning. So I think this year, despite a 6-6 record, you did that in spite of poor offensive play. And I think that this team could really build around their defense, create a better defensive culture that Denny Sussman and Billy Bowman set off to leave behind a defining culture. And I think that's going to be huge for the Oklahoma Sooners going into next season. And when a prestigious franchise like this, they kind of have a mediocre year, a lot of eyes go to the head coach. Brent Venables is not the problem, in my opinion, however, because he has made the most of what he can do with this Oklahoma team for the past 3 years. And really only one of those seasons right there in the middle was truly successful in their last season in the Big 12. The other ones have been, by Oklahoma standards, not the greatest. That's not Brent Venables' fault. He has to work with what is alongside him, and he has done his best to make the situation as good as possible. Get involved in the run game a little bit more when you might have shoddy quarterback play. Put an emphasis on defense and not be afraid to pull the trigger if your 5-star prospect isn't performing up to par and is having turnovers that are costing you games. And Venables, if he proved anything this year, it's that he's going to do all that he can to make sure his Oklahoma team wins as many games as possible. And for that, I don't think it's right to fault him for just a 6-6 record, especially your first year in the SEC. I think Venables has all the tools to be another great Oklahoma coach. Perhaps not to the level of Stoops or even Lincoln Riley, because that's a high standard. But he's very, very competent in his own right. And in conclusion on all of this, from the quarterback controversies, from the defensive identity, to hopefully sticking with your head coach, I think that Oklahoma learned a lot in their first year in the SEC, and it wasn't always easy. But there were some great moments in there, like the Alabama game, and plenty of positive takeaways moving forward. It was always going to be a transition. I think that can often be forgotten about, especially with the way that Texas went in. It has been a great team this year. But ultimately, Texas is the exception, not the rule. And this is always going to be a transition for Oklahoma, and it absolutely was. But the main thing to look for with that transition are positive takeaways that you can build on in the future. And Oklahoma absolutely did that. They showed grit. They showed toughness. They showed determination in the face of adversity so often. And there are a lot of positives for the Sooners moving forward. Got to figure out the quarterback situation, if that's Mike Hawkins Jr. or otherwise. Danny Sussman, Billy Bowman, they're going to be hard to replace. But they instituted a defensive culture that is going to continue on in Oklahoma. And while it was a very up and down season in the SEC, and then that latter half of the season, it was mostly down aside from that Bama game. Oklahoma is one of the most storied college football franchises in history, and that is for a reason. They will not back down from this challenge, and they will take on the SEC head on, even when they falter. Thank you for listening. This has been State of the Association. I'm your host, Nash Roberts.